Good morning, good evening, wherever you are in this world. And I titled this David Messiah because I will show you some Old Testament prophecies regarding the Messiah where he is called David. And if you're a Christian, obviously you believe Jesus is the promised Jewish Messiah. So you might be surprised to find that the prophets call him David as well. So let's have a look at some scriptures here. We have this from Hosea chapter 3, verse 5. Afterward, the Israelites will turn and seek the Lord their God and their Davidic king. Then they will submit to the Lord in fear and receive his blessings in future days. Net Bible that I'm using has a footnote on this verse. The Messiah is frequently pictured as the new David because he will fulfill the ideals of the Davidic covenant and be everything that David and his descendants were commissioned to be. For example, they have Isaiah 9, verse 7, 16:5, and then Jeremiah verses there in chapter 23, 30, 33, and in Ezekiel 34 and 37, other examples where the Messiah, the promised future Messiah, is called David. And we have this from Jeremiah 30, verse 9. For my people will serve the Lord their God and David their king, whom I will raise up for them. So you see that the prophet Jeremiah speaking here for God, and sometimes the prophets also speak as God himself in the first person. And again, this is about a future time. And the Net Bible says that the Davidic ruler, which I will raise up as king over them, refers to a descendant of David who would be raised up over a regathered and reunited Israel and Judah. He is called David. And we saw Hosea 3:5, and then the same Ezekiel 34 and 37. And the Messiah is referred to as a shoot or sprig of Jesse in Isaiah 11, verses 1 and 10, and a righteous branch springing from David, meaning the Davidic line. He is called David because he is from the Davidic line and because David is the type of the ideal king whom the prophets look forward to. Now, in agreeing with this, it does not mean that King David himself will not be raised from the dead, parousia, or the second coming of the Messiah. I believe he will be, as all the patriarchs before him and after him will be raised from the dead. The righteous people, those standing in a right faith with the God of Israel, I believe they will be raised. So it does not discount the resurrection of the historical King David himself. But here I'm just showing you how the Messiah is also called David. And many agree with this view, obviously. We have this from a commentary in Jeremiah, where again it says Jeremiah 30, verse 9 refers to the ideal messianic king, not a resurrected David. Compare Amos 9:11. The Targum, which is a Jewish commentary of the Old Testament, identifies this idealized king as Messiah, the son of David. New Testament writers were careful to link Jesus to the family of David as evidence that he was the fulfillment of the coming Messiah anticipated in the Old Testament. And then we have Matthew 1, Luke 1, and 2 there for reference. This is the third messianic passage in the book, the others being in Jeremiah 3, 23, 31, and 33. Jeremiah makes the point clearly that the approaching national disaster and the judgment on the last kings of the Davidic monarchy would not annul the promises God had made to David. In another work called Messianic Revelations in the Old Testament, Jeremiah 30, verse 9 proceeds to prophesy that a total life of service to Yahweh is also to be rendered, and to David their king. The phrases to Yahweh and to David are parallel statements. So to serve Yahweh is to serve David as well, because Yahweh and David are inseparable, according to this author. David himself, who had died and was buried, was not to be personally, physically restored. Rather, a Davidic descendant and representative is to be expected. And this expectation is to rest solidly on Yahweh's strongly stated promise, whom I will cause to rise up for them. Hence, the Davidic king Jeremiah refers to is not physically present at the time, in the coming days Yahweh will bring him forth and set him in their midst. This king will receive the same service Yahweh calls for from his people. But again, I must stress, I do believe that David himself will be raised from the dead at the parousia. So this typology, if you will, does not discount that truth. Jeremiah makes further reference to a Davidic king in chapter 30, verse 21. He was spoken of as the majestic one, a derivative of the Hebrew verb to be great, high, or noble, and as the wise ruling one who was to come from among the people. Moses had spoken of the covenant people's king coming from among the people, Deuteronomy 17, verse 15, and Samuel had gone to a family of Judah and anointed David among his family and nation. 1 Samuel 16. Yahweh's promise through Moses and his deed and promise to David are to hold true. The Davidic house is not to be removed, but a Davidic descendant, a noble and majestic person, a wise ruler, is to be raised up by Yahweh. Beyond a doubt, Jeremiah is referring to the same person he had spoken of when he prophesied concerning the faithful and greatest shepherd, the branch raised up to David, Jeremiah 23, verse 5. And we have this from another commentary. The deprivation envisaged in Hosea 3, verse 4 is both political and cultic, so that the promised restoration also must involve both cultic and political spheres. They will again seek Yahweh their God and David their king. Jeremiah 30, verse 9, also features the Hosean pairing of God and king, but uses serve, the Hebrew avad, which, like the word seek, is a term that can have both cultic and non-cultic senses, but they shall serve the Lord their God and David their king. I hope you can notice here that Davidic king, the human Davidic Messiah of the one God of Israel, is not only worshipped but served alongside Yahweh, the one God of Israel. This is typical of the Old Testament prophets in describing the ultimate Messianic Davidic king of the age to come. David is a type of the Messiah. Both suffer but eventually become king, receive the kingdom, and are victorious over their enemies. However, the Messiah's kingdom and his victory over the forces of evil are far greater than David's. Many of the prophets spoke of David being king in the Messianic era, which is a reference to the Messiah. Hosea also states that Israel would seek David their king in the latter days. As David suffered and was persecuted by Saul before becoming king, so the Messiah was to be rejected at first. A hint of this is seen in Hannah's prayer and Micah's reference to the judge of Israel being struck on the cheek. So these are just but a few references you can find throughout biblical scholarship pointing to this use of the name David for the Messiah. And it's important to note that just because the Messiah Jesus shared names and he shares titles and he shares even imagery with others, including obviously the one God of Israel, it does not mean they're one and the same person or a person of some mysterious Trinitarian Godhead. So shared titles, once again, like shared names and even shared imagery, does not the same identity make.